Spoof movies are easily one of the most controversial subgenres out there. You either love or hate them, and in the late 2000s and early 2010s, it felt like there was a new spoof movie releasing every single week. That's not to say there weren't these kinds of movies before and after this, because there certainly were, and many of the classics came before this time, but as someone who grew up loving spoof movies and was a kid in the 2000s and 2010s, there really was an endless amount of spoofs. Then like the flip of a switch, they suddenly vanished. So what happened to spoof movies, and will they ever return to the big screen? Let's find out. What's the first film that comes to mind when you hear the words spoof movie? Do you think of the Scary Movie franchise, or maybe Austin Powers? The reality is, spoof movies have a pretty large spectrum, making it somewhat difficult to define the genre. To complicate things a little further, the idea of a parody movie isn't quite the same thing as a spoof movie, though these terms are often used to describe the same type of film, and that's not necessarily wrong. These movies take from other films or the tropes of a genre as a whole and essentially flip it on its head. Sometimes spoofs are made as a tribute or as satire, maybe criticizing the stereotypes of certain genres and doing it in a super over-the-top way. Spoof movies often feel slightly outside of the reality we know. The world just works differently in these films, and the way you would expect something to play out never goes how you think it would. Take this train scene from Top Secret, for example. At first glance, it looks like a train leaving the station, but as the camera goes out the window, we see that it's not leaving the station, but rather the station itself is leaving on a truck. It's hilarious gags and moments like these that catch the audience off guard and make spoof movies so special. The humor can be accomplished in so many different ways, such as exaggerating things, using slapstick comedy, non sequiturs, cartoon-like physics, and so much more. It's an endless playground to make comedy out of anything and everything. That's why spoof movies aren't just regular old comedy. They have another layer to them that's absurd and silly. You might be wondering where spoof movies even came from. Well, we have to take a step back into 1905, where Edwin S. Porter created The Little Train Robbery, a remake of his own film from 1903 called The Great Train Robbery. But in this remake, instead of it starring adults like the original, he used children for all of the characters, and they didn't ride on a big train, but rather a small one. It might not be up to par with the type of humor we have today, but for the time, it's pretty hilarious that Porter made this film, and it's now recognized as the start of spoof movies. The genre wouldn't pick up much in the 1910s and 1920s, but by the 1930s and 1940s, a lot more satire and silliness started to appear in movies. Not all of the films that were coming out had success, such as The Gorilla from 1939, a film about investigators that are hired by a wealthy man to protect him from a killer dressed as a gorilla, but it actually turns out to just be a real gorilla. When it was released, the New York Times wrote a negative review about it, stating, "It's all supposed to be either really funny or shockingly thrilling, depending on how you look at it." This was certainly still a time where these types of films were trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, and how to balance the comedy with other genres. Also, audiences didn't really know how to take films like this, but only a year after The Gorilla, in 1940, The Great Dictator released, and set a whole new standard for what a satirical film is and can be. Charlie Chaplin created the film as an anti-war political satire to address his concerns of fascism and Hitler at the time. It was released in the middle of World War II and dared to make fun of the Nazis and laugh in Hitler's face. This film really showed the power of comedy and satire and how impactful it could be on the world. I think a lot of the time spoof movies and comedies in general are looked at as simply funny entertainment, but the truth is they can still hold a very powerful message within them and teach us all a lesson.
Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little.
I'm not saying spoofs or comedies have to do this, but they absolutely can if they want to, and Charlie Chaplin proved this better than anyone. After the success of The Great Dictator, the genre really started to pick up, and in the 1950s, comedy duo Abbott and Costello put out several films where they would encounter classic horror characters such as The Invisible Man and The Mummy. These series of films are definitely goofy, but it was certainly a unique spin and blend of genres. Then from there in the 1960s, spy movies became very popular, popular, resulting in numerous spoofs and parodies of that genre, and spoofs would only continue to grow more and more. The 1970s brought along classics such as the Kentucky Fried Movie, Young Frankenstein, and Monty Python. The 1980s gave us Airplane, Spinal Tap, and The Naked Gun, and the 1990s blessed us with Austin Powers. There's so many more great movies I could mention from these years, but the list is honestly huge. The main thing to note is over these years, the genre really innovated and found its place within the mainstream. I can't make this video without mentioning the great directors, writers, actors, and actresses who helped define the spoof genre. Mel Brooks is easily the king of spoofs. Even though he wasn't the first to do it, he really helped take things to the next level with movies such as The Producers, a spoof about Broadway productions and, of course, their producers, Blazing Saddles, a satirical take on westerns, and Young Frankenstein, a spoof of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Mel Brooks was never afraid to poke fun at something and really helped set the groundwork for years to come. Similar to what Charlie Chaplin did with The Great Dictator, Mel Brooks did with all of his films. They were hilarious but also taken seriously because Brooks cared about the story first, which only helped the comedy thrive. Other directors such as David Zucker, Jim Abrahams, and Jerry Zucker also pushed the genre forward with films such as Airplane, Top Secret, Scary Movie 3, and Naked Gun. These three collaborated across their films to make some of the most classic spoof movies of all time and were even known by their trio name of Zaz. With the increasing number of spoof movies, there became numerous actors and actresses throughout the years who became associated with the genre. Leslie Nielsen became known for his roles in Naked Gun and Airplane, Anna Faris became famous for playing Cindy Campbell in the Scary Movie franchise, and Graham Chapman hit it big by helping write Monty Python and also playing King Arthur as well as other characters in the franchise. The list of actors and actresses who had an impact on the genre is just as big as the list of classic spoof movies, and even though I can't recognize them all by name in this video, I absolutely pay my respect for all that they have contributed. The 2000s became a very interesting time for spoof movies, and the genre started to shift in a new direction. On July 7th of 2000, the world was blessed by the Scary Movie franchise. The first film would reshape and influence spoof movies for years to come. The first film is directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans and written by Shawn Wayans, Marlon Wayans, and Buddy Johnson. It was created after the success of the slasher film Scream. The first Scary Movie was a huge success and made a whopping $278 million at the box office with a budget of only $19 million. During this time, raunchy comedy movies such as American Pie, Road Trip, and Austin Powers were having great success with audiences, and Scary Movie took full advantage of that. It was very in your face, super crude and outlandish, and teenagers absolutely loved it.
What's up? What's up?
It was packed full of sex and drugs and everything else your parents didn't want you watching. It truly marked a new era of spoof movies and took traditional ideas from the classics and put a new spin on everything. Since Scary Movie decided to spoof Scream, a movie already making fun of slasher films, the humor sort of gets out of control and way more over the top than any spoof movies before it. To some, Scary Movie might even be downright offensive, but at the same time, that's sort of what makes it so great. There's no real limit to how far the film will take things. After its success, a sequel was greenlit, and only a year later, Scary Movie 2 made its way into theaters. Unlike the first film, the second one pokes fun at a much larger variety of films, such as The Exorcist, Poltergeist, and the Amityville Horror, and it ties these different films together through jokes and small scenes. The Scary Movie franchise took the spoof world by storm and made a huge impact. After these movies were released, the amount of spoof movies being created really picked up. In the 2000s alone, there were around 78 spoof movies, at least according to the Spoof Parody Movie Wikipedia. This was the biggest decade of releases for the genre ever, and with that led to more great films as well as a lot of bad ones. The truth is, as much of a blessing as Scary Movie was to spoof movies, it sort of also put them in a weird spot. For the next few years, we still receive some really well thought out spoofs such as as Austin Powers and Goldmember that kept the heart of the series but elevated it to a new scale with bigger set pieces and more stars. Shaun of the Dead came out in 2004 and was a hilarious take on the zombie movie genre that also blended in British humor. In 2006, Borat took a new approach to the mockumentary world by making fun of American culture, and in 2008, Tropic Thunder shook things up by being a satirical take on both war films and many aspects of Hollywood as a whole. As well as these movies did at having their own voice, a lot of other movies released during the 2000s started to struggle with having their own identity. Films such as Date Movie, Epic Movie, Meet the Spartans, Superhero Movie, and Disaster Movie tried to chase the success of the Scary Movie franchise by choosing a genre to parody, then picking a handful of movies to reference and make fun of. Now, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy some of these movies when they were released, but I was also in middle school when many of these came out. I've watched several of them recently and could barely get through them, and there was even a couple that I just straight up turned off. The difference between these films and the first two Scary Movies, for instance, is that the writing and humor was actually well thought out, and you could tell that there was effort and passion behind the Scary Movies. Even with some of the low shots that Scary Movie took, films like Meet the Spartans are just so on the nose and try way too hard to make something funny. Sadly, the Scary Movie franchise would later become plagued with these similar issues, but even Scary Movie 3 and Scary Movie 4 still have some heart and passion in them, and I can't say the same about a film like Disaster Movie. Now, I don't think there's only two people who could be blamed for the downfall of spoof movies, but at the same time, a lot of those bad movies I mentioned, such as Date Movie and Meet the Spartans, were created by Jason Fredberg and Aaron Seltzer. Fredberg and Seltzer wrote the screenplay for the 1996 film Spy Hard, which in my opinion is a pretty rough film, but it was fairly successful. Even though this was their first film, some of the mistakes and bad writing in it are pretty terrible, and it's honestly surprising that they were given money to make films after this, but somehow they still went on to write numerous scripts and direct several films. Usually you see some sort of improvement over the course of a filmmaker's career, but it's pretty hard to say that with these two. Unlike the Wayans who brought Scary Movie to life, pretty much everything Fredberg and Seltzer have done feels uninspired and in many instances just downright lazy. It is important to note that Jason and Aaron did write for the Scary Movie franchise, but with those films they actually had creative and clever writers above them to make things actually funny and worth watching. Maybe Jason and Aaron's ideas aren't bad on the surface, but it takes good writing to actually make them work. I really don't want to bash these guys, but at the same time, their films feel like a slap in the face to all the classic spoof movies that came before. It feels like they don't respect the genre and the groundwork that was set to make it so popular, and just pushed out as many of these movies as they could. Looking back on some of their films now is very interesting because when I went and rewatched some of them like Epic Movie, it was fascinating to see all the pop culture references made, and it did somewhat bring me back to that time, but even these pop culture references feel like they're just placed in the movie to be there, and they don't add up to anything or really say anything about the time. What's almost crazier is how long these two made these types of films for, with the majority of them being successful at the box office, even if the reviews were terrible. Like I said, I don't think these two can be blamed entirely for the downfall of spoof movies, but they definitely left a stain on the genre and led others to create similar underwhelming films. If you haven't already noticed, the comedy genre has been struggling for the last several years. It seems like there's just a lack of comedy movies as a whole, and as a result, this has also affected spoof movies. Like I said, with many of the 2000s and even 2010 spoof movies, a lot of them were pretty crude and not afraid to make jokes. With the current time we're living in, a lot of people get easily offended, and this has made Hollywood step back from putting out these types of edgy comedy movies that we once adored and loved. Since spoof movies often push the boundaries of both humor in general and comment on current topics, I think this has certainly impacted the genre. Also, with the internet, we get so many memes and funny short videos that comment on current events almost instantly, and seeing these types of jokes in a movie months later wouldn't really hit as strong as they used to. So if a new spoof movie does come out, it'll have to be very cautious to not quickly feel outdated if it is going to comment on pop culture or recent events. We went went from around 70 plus spoof movies coming out in the 2000s and another 50 or so coming out in the 2010s to maybe like 5 that I can think of that have come out in the 2020s. It's honestly sad to see because I think these types of films are needed now more than ever. I mean, just think about the impact of The Great Dictator. There's so much out there to make a great spoof movie, and if someone was willing to take the risk and find a clever and unique way to innovate the genre, it could be really successful. Spoof movies hold a very special place in my heart and in the history of filmmaking. A genre that is often looked at as being ridiculous and silly has actually had a lot of impact and great films that have come out of it. It has certainly declined over the years and became oversaturated with a lot of bad movies that were out there to make a quick buck, but the classics that defined and reshaped the genre deserve to be recognized for everything they achieved. If spoof movies are going to make a comeback, it'll take some brave filmmakers willing to risk it all to find new, creative, and clever ways to make films that audiences can laugh at and be inspired by. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on spoof movies and what your favorite ones are. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like and consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.